Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about risk analysis with Safran Risk. My name's Ian Nicholson. I'm going to be the key presenter here. I've been a risk analysis and consultant for a number of years. I've been working to do risk analysis in a number of industries. I started working with risk analysis on cost estimates in construction projects back in the 90s. And I've been working with schedule risk analysis since 2001 when my company became the Canadian reseller for PertMaster software. Joining me today is Mary Lynn Backstrom, who's an implementation specialist with Emerald. She'll be handling any questions or anything that come in. Mary Lynn's got a number of years experience working with risk analysis tools and scheduling in general as well. So why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, there's a whole number of different reasons why we might want to conduct risk analysis on our projects. The first one is it helps the project teams and project executives understand and manage the risks on a project. It gets the project team discussing the challenges of the project and keeps the team focused on the right issues. So not only do we look at our critical path, which is what we've historically been taught to focus on, but we can also look at the near critical paths that may come back and cause us trouble as the project progresses. Now, risk analysis is a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes. And the reason for that is that there's a general understanding that risk is part of every project. And not only that, but there are dependencies between cost and schedule that need to be fully understood. I'm in Alberta, Canada. We have a group here called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta. And that group basically is, as the name implies, companies who do a lot of construction projects, typically mega projects in the oil and gas space. And they've done a number of studies on risk analysis. And one of them, the key things they found out quite early on is that when you do risk analysis on your projects, you significantly reduce the project cost growth on those projects. Now ask yourself, do you build detailed critical path method schedules? Do you develop detailed cost estimates? Well, I'm pretty sure you do, but the chances of meeting your project schedule and financial goals are still typically not very large, or maybe a lot less than you think. So how can this be? Well, there's a number of things that can haunt you when you're working on your project. The first thing is we do detailed scheduling, but the problem is we enter all of our data as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainties. So we'll estimate that there's going to be 3 people working on this activity for 4 days at $100 an hour. But assumptions change over time, and sometimes they don't match reality. Maybe this activity is actually going to take 5 days, or maybe we're going to need 4 people to do it, or $100 an hour isn't a realistic rate. Those are all things that might change that can cause our schedule to change. We also do detailed cost estimating. But what's the problem there? Well, sometimes our estimators are too optimistic or too pessimistic. I mean, the bid process in general encourages very aggressive estimates in order to even get the work. Other times, estimators may add some contingency in various places. Estimates may be built on historical experience, which is no longer valid. And estimates may be built based on some smaller scale or larger scale project. And when we scaled our project, that's not an accurate model that we develop. And the other thing that happens is sometimes people know that a project won't go ahead if the estimate is above a certain amount. So they'll work the estimate down to make sure the project does go ahead. And in all of those cases, we end up with cost estimates which don't really reflect what's going to happen out in the field. Now, all these items are deterministic. So what's the problem with deterministic estimates and schedules? Well, the problem is they just don't take uncertainty into account, and uncertainties can build on one another to make a project that's very different from what was originally visualized. I mean, there's uncertainty in everything we do. The classic example is, I drive my car to work every day, or at least I did until the pandemic came along, and it typically takes me about 15 minutes to get to the office. Some days it takes me 20 minutes, some days it takes half an hour. And and I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take me to get to work, but I can tell you that it's going to take me exactly 18 months and $1.2 billion to build this mega project in the middle of nowhere. So, we have to be realistic that there's uncertainty everywhere. And there hasn't really been an easy way for us to build a model that takes into account uncertainties both with the cost and schedule models. Like, we know that cost and schedule are intrinsically linked, but in the past, we've really had no way to build a probabilistic cost and schedule model together. Again, going back to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, on average, Alberta-based mega project experienced a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. So again, these things are fairly tightly correlated. So what we need risk management. We need to be able to model our schedules and costs more accurately. We need to limit our financial exposure. We need to actually have reproducible results. So we need a methodology and an audit trail to make sure that our risk management process is consistent and repeatable. What we want out of this is we want to get an improved likelihood for project success. We want to have more confidence in our results. We want to get buy-in from our team members. We want to increase our maturity overall. And finally, we really want to be able to restore everything in one common database. So for many years, I worked with Primavera Risk Analysis, which was originally called PERTmaster. And it was a great tool at the time, but unfortunately, development stopped around almost 10 years ago in 2013. And the reality is that things have moved on. And I've been working for the last couple of years with Safran Risk Analysis. And Safran Risk Analysis is a real step forward. And it was developed by the same people who developed the original PERTmaster tool. So they kind of looked at it and said, okay, if we were starting again from scratch, what would we do differently? What have we learned over the last 20 years that would allow us to build a better risk analysis tool? Now, the key things that this tool allows us to do is it allows us to put ranges on our estimates. It allows us to look at risk events. It allows us to model our costs with our schedule, and I'll talk about that as we go through the demo on the tool. And it just allows us to get a better understanding of what the probability of achieving our end dates and costs is. It helps us understand key drivers on the project. It helps us run different scenarios, and it helps us effectively analyze our mitigation strategies to see which ones will be effective. So let's dive in. We're going to take a look at the tool. I'm just going to switch to my screen here. Okay, so this is what Safran Risk looks like. The first thing when you come in is it just has a little welcome page that's going to show you just a few options here, things like what modules do I see, things like that, whether I want to import a project from Primavera or Microsoft project or Safran project for that matter. I'm going to open up a project here. This is just a simple demo project. Now, when you open the tool up, you see your Gantt chart. This is built on Safran project, and Safran project is a lot like P6 in terms of its functionality. You can actually manage the schedule in here fairly easily. You can create layouts and filters and all that sort of thing, just like you would in P6. You can change your logic. You can do any of the sort of things that you might want to do. The system is built on a back-end database. It's built on SQL Server, so it does have the capability of handling much larger data sets than the old PRA tool would do, which was a desktop tool that relied on flat files for data storage. Everything's stored in this SQL Server database, which makes the system much faster. Now, across the top of the screen, you'll see that I have a number of tabs here. I'm in the Schedule tab right now, but I have all these tabs that basically represent all the various modules that I'm going to use for my risk analysis. And the tool is set up so I basically work from right or from left to right. So I'm going to start with my Schedule tab. Then I can go to my next tab, which is my Schedule Warnings tab. And this is just like you would see in PRA or any other risk tool. It's going to give you warnings about things that may affect the risk analysis and prevent you from getting a good result. There is a full DCMA 14-point check option available as well in the tool. And the idea is that anytime it tells you about something that it's warning you about, you can use the links to jump to that particular activity, and you can make changes and fix the problems, in which case the schedule warnings will update as you go. So you can work through the list, you can fix the problems and make sure that you've got a robust schedule for risk analysis. The next tab over is the Project Risks tab. Now, one of the things that they did when they developed this tool, instead of having uncertainties in one place and risk events in another place, they made the decision to put everything into the Project Risks module. So all of my uncertainties and all of my risk events all go into this particular module. And then what we'll do after we put all the risks in here, in the risk register essentially, we'll then map those risks to our activities. So again, this is a big change from what you would have seen if you are a PRA user, where your uncertainties went directly on the activities and you had a separate risk register for risk events. In this case, everything goes in here. And the difference is is in the probability. So a risk event is typically going to have a probability associated with it. So in this case, if I choose my first risk here, which is that there's an ash cloud, this demo project is to build a UAV, an unmanned air vehicle. And one of the things we have to do is we have to build it, and then we've got to test it. So if there's an ash cloud, we may have some trouble doing our testing. So in this case, we're saying there's a 40% chance that that could happen. If it does happen, it has a schedule impact. And that schedule impact can be relative or it can be an absolute impact. So a relative impact is a percentage of the original duration and or cost. And an absolute impact would be an impact that is measured in hours or days or weeks, but has an absolute time associated with it, or cost for that matter. Now you'll notice that I have a pre-mitigated position and I also have a post-mitigated position for each risk. So again, I can define for any risk or any uncertainty a pre-mitigated and a post-mitigated position. So this gives me more flexibility in that I can go on my uncertainties and I can define those post-mitigated uncertainties as well as just my post-mitigated risks, as I used to be able to do in PRA. Now, I can also have just general uncertainties. So under my risk types here, you can see that I've got some for estimate uncertainties. Again, they're entered the same way, but under the risk type, they're entered as an estimate uncertainty. And I'll show you how those work differently than our standard risks when we get to the next module. Additionally, I can also have calendar risks. So in this case, I've got a calendar risk defined. And those work like the probabilistic calendars would do in PRA. However, the system does have a lot more flexibility in defining those calendars. I'm not going to get into calendars or probabilistic calendars in depth today because we just don't have time. But if anybody's interested, you can reach out to us and we can talk more about that. So essentially, that's how we define all of our risks. So something that's just an uncertainty would be defined either as an estimate uncertainty or as a standard risk with 100% probability of occurrence. Something that's a risk event can be defined as a standard risk with a probability of occurrence. And then for any of these risks, we can then define what the impact is going to look like. So once we've entered all of these risks, we can then go to the Risk Mapping tab. And here, this, again, for those who used PRA before, this is going to look a lot like the risk event mapping in PRA, except that it's a little more flexible in the way that it works. The first thing is that those items that we put in as estimate uncertainties end up on the left-hand side of the screen. So we've got a low, medium, high estimate uncertainty. Now those items are set up as radio buttons. So I can choose one of them, but I can't choose more than one of them, right? So if I choose high estimate uncertainty, for example, I can't also choose low estimate uncertainty. So I choose one or the other, or I choose that there's no estimate uncertainty. Now, the other uncertainties, the standard uncertainties, are all over here on the right, and I can choose to assign them to as few or as many activities as I need to. Now, when I have actually, if I choose a particular activity, and let me just go down to the design section and I'll choose one here. We'll choose the overall design template, and let me just open my screen up a bit here. And what you see here is it will actually give us a list of all the risks that you have assigned to this particular activity, and it will show you what that distribution looks like for each of the assigned risks. So it will say, you know, there's a 40% chance here that we're going to have an ash cloud. Here's what it looks like. Then there's a 10% chance that we're going to have a merger or acquisition issue, and here's what that looks like. It shows it for pre-mitigated position and for post-mitigated positions. Now, if I go to the schedule impact tab on the bottom of the screen, it will show me each of those risks that I've associated to the activity, what they look like, and then it will show me the overall impact on this particular activity. Now, this is really useful because, first of all, I can assign multiple uncertainties to one activity. So in the past, if I had two uncertainties on an activity, and again, I'm going back to the Primavera risk analysis example, I could only put one uncertainty on each activity. So if I actually had two different things that contributed to that uncertainty, I would have to estimate the distribution shape in myself and then assign it to the activity. But in Safran risk, what I can do is I just choose as many as are appropriate, and the system will calculate the overall impact. So this is really powerful when you're dealing with multiple uncertainties. It's also useful to visualize when you've put your risks on, whether the risks that you've associated are in fact realistic or not realistic. So if I end up with an activity that has, you know, maybe it's a 10-day activity and I've put a risk event that's 1,000 days on it or something outrageous, I would see that immediately in this preview screen, and I would see that I'd assigned something that probably was not appropriate because I would end up with a very strange distribution shape. Now, I do have the ability in here as well to add additional risks to an activity just by clicking on them on. So, for example, if I add the design risk, you see it immediately gets added to the list, and I can see the overall impact has been changed. I can also go and assign that same risk to all of the activities in my WBS just by clicking on the header, in which case I can add it to all of the activities in that particular WBS or clear it from all of the activities in the WBS. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in how I do my assignments. All right, I'm going to come back to the cost tab because I'm going to talk about the cost module at the end of the presentation. We also have, let's move on to the correlations tab. Now, in older tools like PRA, we used to associate correlations between activities. Now, that was a bit difficult because, again, if I had multiple uncertainties on one activity and not on another activity, I couldn't correlate the activities to each other. So in Safran risk, what I can do is I actually correlate my risks to each other rather than my activities to each other. So what I can do is I can say, okay, if one risk occurs, then another risk is more or less likely to occur. So I have that flexibility of essentially correlating risks to each other, and then if the risk is associated with the activity, that will generate the correlation between the activities. Now, I've also, because this is a fairly large structure, as you can see, and I have a whole bunch of different risks on my project, I do also have the ability to filter this down quite effectively, so I can manage this in a easier way than if I was just manually type into the boxes. All right, so let's move on to the Analyze tab. Now, on the Analyze tab, I first of all have the option of turning risks on and off when I run the risk analysis. So for example, I could say in this particular analysis, I don't want to consider this particular risk, and I could just turn that risk off by clearing the box. Or what I could do is I could choose to run the post-mitigated position for some of the risks just by clicking the radio button to tell the system to use the post-mitigated position. Now, this is really useful when you want to do what-if analysis around your mitigation strategies, because you have the option to turn things on or off, or to change the position from pre-mitigated to post-mitigated as much as you need to do a what-if analysis. You know, compared to what we used to do in PRA, where we used to have to take multiple copies of the file and make copies and copies and copies and try and rename all those copies to make, and then go back 2 months later and try and figure out what we did. This is a much easier approach, because all we need to do is set up the scenario that we want to run, and if we want to run it again later, we can just set it up again, and everything's stored in this background database, so it's all stored there as long as we need it. Now, we also have the ability in the system to determine what we call focus activities and or focus costs. And the idea is that, you know, when I'm doing risk analysis, quite often I don't really need to look at the last activity in the schedule. So let's say I'm doing a construction project, and at the end of the project, there's a whole number of demobilization activities, right? Well, if what I care about is when do I turn the plant over to the owner, so my transfer of care, custody, and control, or TCCC as we call it, if that's what I really care about, there might be 6 months of demob activities afterwards, which don't really impact the overall project from a risk perspective. What I care about is when am I going to turn this over? So what I can do is I can define a focus activity for those intermediate milestones that I really need to monitor when I'm doing the analysis, or alternately for key cost elements that I want to keep track of. Now, the system by default runs Monte Carlo analysis. So you can choose to use Latin hypercube analysis if you want. And I don't want to get into the pros and cons of each in this discussion, but you can run either one. You can also choose to include correlations or exclude correlations. You can resource level after each iteration, useful if you're doing turnaround type projects. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to run the analysis as is. I've got all my risks turned on. I'm going to run 1,000 iterations. I'm going to click run the analysis. And the system will come up with my distribution curve. So it's basically showing me what my results are likely to be on this project. Now, in this case, what the tool is telling me is that my deterministic finish, which is September the 26th, is about 23% likely to occur. Actually, sorry, it's lower than that. It's 3% likely to occur. And it's telling me that if I want a P50 comfort level, I need to be out around the end of December. If I want P70, I need to be looking at the beginning of February. And it also tells me that for P90 confidence level, I need to be out into the beginning of April. So it's giving me an idea, just like any other risk tool would, of what my likelihood of achieving my result is and how much contingency I'm likely to need on my schedule. Now, by the way, if you want to, you can do a step through of the analysis, so you can actually click through and watch the schedule and make sure everything's moving properly. So that is available as well. And maybe what I'll do is I'll show that when we get to the cost section. Okay, now, I mentioned before that I might have some intermediate dates that I really care about. Those are my focus activities. So again, what I can do is I can choose those focus activities, and I can say, okay, this is the activity that I really care about, and I can see what the distribution is likely to be for that particular activity rather than the entire schedule. Now, if I go back to my overall schedule, I do get all my activities available in there, so I can scroll through and I can choose a particular activity and I can see the distribution for that particular activity. The focus activities just makes it quicker to get there if I'm repeatedly going back to the same activity. One of the other things that's really nice about the way the tool works is right now I'm grouped by WBS, but if I was grouped by, say, an activity code, the grouping from the scheduling module will carry through to all of these other modules as well. So I don't necessarily always have to work on my WBS grouping. Okay, so a couple of other things that we can look at on this. Let me go back up to the top. The system does also allow me to look at a data view of the results, and it will show me for each iteration that I ran of the analysis where I ended up in terms of my duration and my cost, and which of my risks fired during that particular iteration. And the coloring that changes on those changes from a dark red to more of a pink color to a light green to a dark green. That's just showing you how showing you where you were on the distribution for that particular risk during that particular iteration. So as the colors get darker, it means you were at the more extreme positive or negative values. So it's red if you had a negative impact, it's green if you had a positive impact, and the color gets darker as the impact gets larger. Now, what's useful about this is that I can actually sort the various iterations and see what my longest duration was. So my longest duration came in at, let's see here, let's go right to the top, 557 days. It's actually a 558 there as well. That should have been right at the top. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. So I can see here that on my longer distributions, if I choose one, for example, this one here, I can actually click on the iteration and it will show me exactly what happened in that particular iteration of the schedule. So it'll take me to the Gantt chart and show me the Gantt chart from that iteration. So if you're trying to understand why you had some very extreme values in your analysis, you can actually drill in and actually see what happened during that particular iteration to understand what caused a very long or very short duration. So again, very useful tool to allow you to understand the results that you're getting. You can see which risks fired and what happened when they did fire. The system will also show you the things that drove the results that you obtained in the analysis. So it will show which risks were driving the finish date of the project, as well as which activities were driving the finish date of the project. So this is your classic tornado chart. But again, the nice thing is that because all of your risk events and uncertainties are all in the risks module, you can see the result of all of them here together. So again, rather than seeing them as two separate places and treating them as two separate kinds of risks, you're treating them as one kind of risk so they can be compared to each other. And again, you can also look at it from the perspective of which activities are driving your project. So again, a lot of flexibility in there. Now, one of the things that we always want to do is we always want to focus on the risks that are going to have the biggest impact on our project. And a few years ago, I was working with a client, and this client told me that, you know, they would go and present the results that they got from Primavera risk analysis to management, and management would say, okay, you know, ash cloud has a 60% correlation to the finish date, but what does that mean in real life terms? So what they would do is they would go and turn the risk off, rerun the analysis and say, okay, if we can remove this risk, we can save this much time. And they would do that manually for every risk that showed up high on the tornado, which might be the top 10 or 20. And they would rerun the analysis, copy the results to Excel to try and see what the results of that are. And now we call that analysis by exclusion, and it's a very tedious process to go through manually. But Safran has actually built that right into the tool. So what I can do in Safran is I can actually tell the tool that I want to look at my my analysis by exclusion automatically. So if I click on calculate the impacts, what the system is going to do is it's going to run through and turn each of those risks off and then show me the results. And it's going to turn off the first one, then it's going to turn off the second one, then it's going to turn off the third one. And so in this case, I can see exactly what the impact is going to be of each of those risks. Now, in this case, I've told it I want to do multiple passes, so I'm actually going to see the cumulative effect. So what the system is doing is it's turned off that first risk and said, okay, by turning off that risk, we're going to save 45 days in our schedule. Then what it's going to do is it's going to leave that one off and then turn off the second highest item, which is the testing overrun, and saying, well, you could save another 42 days if you could eliminate that risk. And then it's going to turn off the third one, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I can tell the system I want to do the multiple pass approach, which is turn off the first one, then leave it off, turn off the second one, turn off the third one, or I can tell the system to just do them in exclusion, in which case when it runs, it'll turn the first one off, then turn it back on and turn the second one off, turn the second one back on, turn the third one off. So I can run it either way, where I look at the cumulative effect or I look at the overall effect. The other thing that it will do is it will also let me look at it from an S-curve perspective. So in other words, it's saying, okay, here's my results that came out of my analysis with all the risks turned on, and here's what I'm saving by turning off each of those risks. So you can see that if I turn each one off, how much time am I going to cumulatively save on my overall risk analysis? So again, this is very powerful, and when we used to have to do this by hand, it used to take a great amount of time, and frankly, that's a waste of people's time because computers do these sort of things so much better than people do. Okay, so I've talked about schedule risk analysis, but what about cost risk analysis? So years ago, when I was working on a project, I was a lead scheduler on a project for Shell. We used to do a cost risk analysis and a schedule risk analysis every quarter as part of our requirements on the project. And the project cost control, the lead cost engineer, and I would each do our own risk analysis, and we never talked to each other about it. And we kind of realized that was kind of silly because, you know, he needed to know how long things were going to take in order to do his calculations. So we started changing a little bit where I would give him the likely outcomes of all of the activities that drove my costs, and he would build those into his cost model. And that's kind of what people used to do. You could also, as opposed to doing two separate models and then manually moving data from one to the other thing that you could do is you could build a resource loaded schedule and do risk analysis on a resource loaded schedule. But building a resource loaded schedule is a lot of work, and maintaining it is a lot of work, and trying to keep it aligned with the cost estimate or as you go through the project is a huge amount of work. So it's not really a feasible way to do risk analysis. Plus, then you've got to model all the cost risks, and those cost risks aren't really schedule related. So you end up having to build a bunch of dummy activities with costs on them. It can be done, but it's a monster. And I've done it, and I would highly not recommend anyone else ever do it. So what Safran did is they said, okay, well, what if we actually allowed you to do a cost risk in a separate module? And I can see I've got an error there, but let's see if it'll continue on. Okay, so they said, what happens if we were to allow you to do a cost estimate risk in its own module and then choose whether you wanted to link that to your schedule? So let me just make a couple of changes here. I'm going to turn off some columns. Here we go. All right, so the first thing that I can do is I can take my cost model and I can actually go on the system and I can put uncertainties on those costs. So for this example here, for example, I've got this line item in my cost estimate of $300,000 for parts. Now I have an uncertainty on that, saying it could be from 240 to 450,000. And I've also assigned risks from my risks module to that cost line item as well. So I can just put a base uncertainty on there, but I can also associate risks. And to do that, I just click on the drop down, and all of the risks from my risks module that we looked at earlier that are cost related will show up here. So in the risks module, if I've assigned a cost risk, it will show up on this list. So then I can choose which of my risks from the risk module are associated with this particular line item in my cost estimate. Now, I don't necessarily have to have a base uncertainty and I don't have to have risks. I can have one or the other or both as appropriate. Now, just like it does with the activities, when I take that line item and I actually assign risks to it, it'll show me the risks that are assigned. It will show me the distribution of those risks. So just like it did in the schedule assignment, it's showing me what it looks like in the cost side, and it will show me the overall impact. So again, here's all of the risks associated with this particular cost line item, and here's the overall distribution that's coming out of it. So just like I saw on the scheduling side, I can build a cost model that has all of the risks associated with it as well. And I can also put in things like formulas and things like that if I need to as well. And I think I actually have one in here where I've defined some variables in there that each have their own uncertainties, and then I've defined a calculation that will give me the overall cost associated with this line item. So I could put things in here like, you know, I can put a variable in on the duration of that particular activity or the quantity of that activity, and I can put an uncertainty around the cost of that quantity, and then from that I can calculate what my cost is going to look like. So I can build more sophisticated cost models than just putting a line item in and putting some uncertainty on it. I can actually put formulas with uncertainty in as well. Now, once I've actually built my cost model, then I have the option of deciding that some of my line items in this cost model are going to be linked to my schedule. And the way I do that is I've got a number of columns here that I can turn on, which is the schedule connection section. And then what I can do is I can choose that I want to link all of a line item or a portion of a line item to one or more activities. So I've got this specialized camera lens cost line item for $1.75 million. What I can do in here is I can say, okay, that is associated with two activities in the schedule. 50% of the cost is associated with fabricate the camera lens. 20% is associated with test the lens, and the remaining 30% is independent of my schedule. So again, I have this ability to say some or all of a particular cost line item can be associated with a schedule activity. So again, I'm maintaining my cost model and my schedule model independently, but then now I can choose to link them so that changes in the schedule will have an impact on my costs. Now, if you want to, you can do this with a hammock activity as well. So I can always create a hammock activity and associate that hammock activity with my cost line items as well. So, you know, if you want to, you don't have to just take your regular activities, you can create hammocks as well. Now, what the system does is, if we take a simple example, let's look at the transportation one that I've linked to one activity. What it does is it looks at the duration of that activity and it calculates a day rate based on the duration of the activity, the cost of the cost item divided by the duration of the activity gives me a day rate cost. And it will then tell me that, okay, so this is going to cost $1,900 per day for this particular activity. Now, when I actually run the analysis, what's going to happen is this number, this 123,000, my numerator is going to change based on my uncertainty and my risks associated with this. So these will be added to this base number, and the duration of the activity is going to change as well. So this day rate will also change with each iteration of the model. So it's doing this calculation where it's saying, okay, the activity duration is changing, the costs are changing, what's my new estimated cost? So again, that's the real power of this, is you can have a lot of different moving parts and it will keep track of all of them for you. Okay, so we've defined our cost line items. We've put the risks in on those cost items. We have also defined some of them as being linked to our activities and some of them not. Now, when I actually go and run the overall analysis, what I can see is I can see how all of those things are going to move around in the schedule. Now, let me just add another column here. So on my iteration value, which is my overall cost on each iteration. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the Analyze section, and this time I'm going to do the step through. So I'm going to run the analysis, and it allows me to do each step of the analysis as I go. So I can do this on the schedule side, and I can see my schedule moving around based on the uncertainties and risk events that I've defined. But I'm going to look at it on the cost screen. Now on the cost screen, what I can see is it will show me, again, for each line item, which risks are firing. They change color when they're firing. So in this case, on this iteration number 10, you can see that this medium cost risk is firing. It's turned to a bright pink color. My testing overrun risk is firing, although it's in the low end, so it's green. And my part supply is not firing in this example. And I can see my overall iteration cost, considering, again, all of the uncertainties and the risks and the schedule linkage for each of my cost line items as I go through each iteration. So as I step through, you can see all the numbers are changing. And when I get tired of watching that, I can hit complete. And now I can go to my distribution graph. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this from a cost basis. So now, when I move from the schedule analysis to the cost analysis, these are the results that I get from the cost module and all of the linking that I did and all the risks and everything that I put in the cost module. So I was about 3% likely to achieve my schedule result, and it's saying I'm about 6% likely to achieve my cost result. And again, it'll show me how much contingency I need for a P50, P70, P90 value, and I can configure these to different values if I like. So this looks very much like the results that I got on the schedule side, except that I'm looking at it from a cost side. So now, again, I can also look at my drivers from a cost perspective. So again, if I click on the cost, it's showing me these are the things that are driving the costs of the overall project. So again, I can drill down and look at any particular line item, but overall, though, it's telling me that my design risk is the thing that's having the largest impact. Similarly, on my sensitivity analysis, I can look at that from a cost perspective as well, and I can see what are the cost items which are having a impact, and if I can remove those, how much cost saving will I get? And finally, and this is the thing that I think everybody is always asking us for, is we can actually look at a scatter plot of time versus costs and look at what we call our JCL, or our joint confidence level. So it's not enough when we're working on a project and let's say we want a P70 result, we want a 70% confidence level. It's not enough for us to look at it from the perspective of, okay, let's get a P70 value on our schedule or a P70 value on our cost. What we really want is what we call the joint confidence level, and that we're going to get a 70% overall confidence level that we will hit our schedule and our cost. And by putting them both in the same model, our scatter plot helps us visualize exactly where those percentages are. So for what you can see here, and it might be a little hard to see when I'm doing it on a webinar, but what you can see is we change from being the orange colored band to the red colored band at our P70. So if I want a P70 joint confidence level, I can choose anything on this first row of red dots. So if I hover my mouse on one of them, there's one at 72%. Here's another one at 71%, and 70%. So again, what you see here is that our curve of P70 values actually becomes quite steep vertically and quite steep horizontally as we get out to more extreme values. But there's a range in here where the curve is changing that we can actually trade off cost versus schedule. So for example, what I could do is I could say, okay, I want to be, say, for example, in here, which is one of my iterations was showed a result of March the 2nd with a cost of $9.5 million, which brought us to a P value, a joint confidence level of 71%. Now, what I could do is I could say, okay, on this curve, I might say, you know what, cost is more important to me than time is. So I could go to my next point down here and say, okay, well, here's a trade-off, right? I could live with moving to the 25th of March, so about a 2-week delay, but I could save myself about $100,000 if I was to do that. So what I can do is I can evaluate the points on this curve, and I can actually generate a complete curve here if I want to, and say, okay, anywhere along this curve gives me a joint confidence level of P70, and therefore I can understand what are the trade-offs that I need to make between my cost and schedule in order to still achieve a P70 outcome. So if cost is more important than schedule, I can trade off some of my time to save some money, and I can make an informed decision as a project team about where I want to be. Now, there is a very interesting presentation that's available that was presented at an AACE conference I was at about 18 months ago, where a company that does a lot of work for the U.S. Department of Energy did a lot of analysis around what they call this this curve, or this, they call it the necklace, which is essentially this collection of dots that represent P70 values in terms of, okay, if I can choose anywhere along this curve, what is the best point for me to choose given the trade-offs that I need to make between cost and schedule? So again, that's available to you. You can run that, and you can confidently say this is where we were going to end up on our project. Now you can also do a probabilistic cash flow out of the system. So you can generate probabilistic cash flows, because again, once we've actually linked our cost items to our schedule, we can then generate a cash flow to give us an idea of when we're likely to spend the money on our project. For one of my clients, this is a very big deal because they have to define how much money they're going to budget each year and make sure that money is achievable, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So for them, it's a really big deal to kind of figure out probabilistically how they're going to spend their money on their project. Okay, so let me go back to my slides here. All right, so we have a number of clients using the tool. If you have specific questions that you would like to ask about the tool, please feel free to put them in the chat now, and we'll answer any questions that we can in the time that we have left. And I'll put my contact information up at the end as well, in case people have other questions that they would like to ask. But if you have any questions at this point, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions so far. So either I did a really good presentation or a really bad presentation. So hopefully it was the former. My contact information is here on the screen. I will stick around for a few minutes in case anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. But my contact information is here. If you think of any questions that you would like to include or like to have answered, please feel free to ask them. Send me an email, and we'll be happy to answer anything that you may need to know about.